Okay, good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce the plenary speaker this morning, Anke Lüdeling. She has been a professor of corpus linguistics and morphology at Humboldt University in Berlin since 2008. And, you know, as the denomination of the professorship suggests, two of her main research areas are morphology and corpus linguistics. And then there's a third one, and we might hear something about this, namely register studies. And for morphology, she has worked a lot on word formation, morphological productivity, compounding, morphological change. And of course, her work in the field of corpus linguistics is most relevant, you know, to this conference. And, you know, her work, especially on the compilation and analysis of learner corpora of German, is the work that is most familiar to most of us people here in the learner corpus research community. So she has compiled a great deal of corpus material, corpora of a historical German, corpora of so-called non-standard language use in German, but also obviously learner corpora, and the most well-known one, I think, is the Falco, so the error-annotated learner corpus of German. Many of us are familiar with this corpus, and also the approach to error annotation, so multi-level standoff error annotation that Anke and her team have developed. And I think, you know, also many of us will be familiar with her and Hagen Hirschmann's chapter in the Handbook of Learner Corpus Research on error annotation. So needless to say, she has, in addition to the corpora, she has also developed a number of computational tools for corpus annotation and analysis. And, you know, her achievements and publications are basically too many to mention, but I'd just like to mention the important two-volume international handbook that she edited with Maria Küte on corpus linguistics that appeared in the handbooks of language and communication sciences with Mouton de Gruyter. She's also a member of the board of the International Journal of Learner Corpus Research of corpus linguistics and linguistic theory, and one of the editors of the Journal of Germanic Linguistics. And today, I think we'll learn something, you know, at least from my point of view, about maybe one of her more recent research interests, namely variation and variability in learner language. And as you can see from her title slide, they now have in Berlin this great collaborative research cluster or center on register, and Anke is one of the members and has a project on register knowledge in advanced learner language. So I think it's a very exciting project, and maybe we'll hear more about, you know, her more recent approach to learner language. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Anke Lüdeling.
Thank you, Markus, and thank you, Eric and Catherine, for inviting me, and thank you all for getting up so early and coming. I'm delighted to be here, and as many people said yesterday, it is so wonderful to be at a real-life, in-person conference again, and in such a beautiful city. I am so delighted with this city. I'd never been to Padova before, and I will certainly come back, and I really like it a lot. Okay, so unlike many of the speakers yesterday, I have no answers. I will start by saying this. I have only questions, and in the end, more questions. I guess that puts me in a long line of researchers who said the questions are more important than the answers. I don't mean to be in, I didn't start out to be in that line. I wanted to have some answers, but it always turns out that way, that I know less after I've studied, or I've studied a phenomenon than I think than I do in the beginning. Okay, so the question today is, how do German L1 and advanced L2 speakers employ nominal word formation patterns in argumentative essays? And I guess to many of you remembering their linguistics lectures, that sounds like an extremely boring question. Word formation has never been very popular, so why should we want to know that? Yeah. Well, I think there are many good reasons that we might want to know this, and these reasons point to areas far beyond German nominal word formation. I think the lexicon that we're thinking of is built other than or different from many of the papers that I've heard yesterday and many of the papers I read in recent years, not just from a list of strings. People have treated the lexicon as a list of strings and have looked at strings and how many of these occur in different corpora, blah, blah, blah. But I think the lexicon, our mental lexicon, is built from lexicalized simplex and complex words, and also some mechanism of forming new productively forming new words. And I think we need to take that into account if we do research on the lexicon, on the mental lexicon. And there's been a lot of work on productivity and lexicalization, but still, after so many years of doing research on this, the relationship between lexicalization and productivity is not yet well understood. And there are more questions than answers in that field. The lexicon, as we know, is also highly influenced by register, among many other factors that I will neglect today, of course. And also the acquisition of register knowledge is not yet well understood. I think we know almost nothing about that. Yeah? So I think the research question above might lead us into more questions that then at some point may yield meaningful answers. I think at first glance we might expect that L2 speakers, and by that I mean learners of a foreign language, German as a foreign language. These are not young children learning German as a second L1 or something, or heritage language, but these are students. All of my data is on students who've learned German in a formal way in a classroom. And I can only make statements about those learners. I'm not talking about others. L2 speakers here use fewer productively formed words. That's an expectation that many people have. Also, L2 speakers generally have a smaller vocabulary. That's also an expectation that has been in the literature forever. And also, underlyingly, and I think none of you believes this, that L1 speakers are always competent writers. But if you look at it at first glance, people may think so. And also, in the practice of comparing corpora, people still have, use that fiction in some way. Yeah? So many learner corpus studies, and we've all done these, and they're great, and we've learned a lot from those, have some phenomenon of interest, be it a syntactic or specific word or some construction or whatever, hedging expressions, whatever we want to look at, some phenomenon of interest, and we compare that in learner corpora and native speaker corpora, or L1 corpora, I should probably say, and then we calculate overuse, underuse, or misuse sometimes, and then we draw some conclusions concerning the acquisition of whatever that phenomenon is. And the underlying assumptions always are the production of the L1 speakers in that reference corpus is homogeneous enough so that we can compare, that we can lump that together as a group. And for my research question, it's also somehow underlyingly assumed without being explicitly said often that that's somehow the input for the acquisition by the learners. And I've put that in brackets because I know that none of you believes that what the learners should learn or acquire is exactly what the native speakers, what the L1 speakers do. Let me start by giving you some examples. This is L1 data from an essay corpus, the Falco corpus that Marcus just mentioned, and I will introduce that corpus in a few slides. Yeah? For those of you who know German, you will immediately see many errors in that data. I will not focus on those errors. It's on feminism. It's on a discussion topic on feminism that I will use as the main source of my examples. And I want to focus on two complex words. those are gegeneinander and Deklarierung. Gegeneinander, against each other really, yeah, is an anaphorically used word that it has a discourse function in that text. And that's absolutely well formed. It is used in a way that it should be used. This is what we find a lot. And it is something that's important as something referring back to whatever is said. So there's some dispute between these and those people, and this against each other then will be blah, blah, blah. The next word also looks like a good word, Deklarierung, declaration. And we'll come back to that later, but those of you who are native speakers of German or competent speakers of German will have some slightly odd feeling about this, and we'll come back to this. Yeah, but what I wanted to show you is that in L1 data, we find many well-formed, completely, of course, many well-formed words, anaphoric words, words with lots of functions, and we also find some odd words, slightly odd, slightly off. This is L2 data. Again, we find wonderful words. Anwendungssituation there's nothing wrong with it. It's used well. It is also, in some way, a discourse word because, or has some, in addition to the content, it has some discourse function because it points to things that were said before and that will be used later. In the example 4, we have the wonderful word BH-brennen. That's bra burning. And let me tell you, many of the people who write these essays on feminism in recent years, these essays were written in recent years, focus on whatever the feminists did was burning their bras all day long, all the time, nothing else. Sometimes I'm really a bit annoyed with those texts. But here we focus on the word, and BH-brennen could be a word, but is not used in that sense. What you could then say is BH-Verbrennung or something. You would have to formulate. So that's what we find. It's slightly odd also. It's maybe more odd than Deklarierung, but you can understand it. It could be a word. It's perfectly well formed in word formation rules or something. Yeah. Now look at these. On the one hand side, you see words like the first words in an essay from an L1, and the other side, you see the first nouns from an essay from L2 speakers. Who knows which is which? I know that there are some speakers of German in the audience. Tell me. See, it's not easy. It's not easy, but it can be done. Eric?
On the right, you have L1.
Yeah. On the right, it's the L1.
Yeah.
L1, L2. Yeah? But as you can see, it's not easy. It's not the case that these advanced learners do many odd things and you see it immediately. And it's also not so very different from each other. These are the texts. Yeah? And these are advanced learners. And these are the texts I took those words from. You don't have to read them now. But if you look at it, you see that nouns in both texts, many of them, it's not even the case that the learners only use very short simplex words and then the L1 speakers use complex words or something. That's just not the case. It is a lot more complicated than this, as is always the case. So the initial observations is the morphological production of advanced L2 speakers goes far beyond lexical and phrasal lists. So BH-brennen has never been in any vocabulary list in any curriculum anywhere. And there is initial evidence, and has been reported before, that learners use word formation patterns productively, if sometimes slightly differently from the L1 speakers. We also find complex morphological networks, and that's important for later on, and lots of morphological priming, and that will also be taken up later in L1 and L2, of course. And still, we find differences, but these differences are far more subtle than what you would think at first. So what can we learn from the production data about the lexical and morphological knowledge of learners? My first question. I cannot answer this question. There will be more. Coming to register. And I know that many of you have worked on register, and I've heard register mentioned in some of the talks yesterday. I used the register definition from our CRC, the one that Marcus just mentioned, which is, of course, builds on many other register definitions. We define register as those aspects of socially recurring, and that's important, socially recurring intra-individual variation that are influenced by situational and functional settings. And as you see, register has many readings, and all of these are relevant. And I cannot give a register talk today, as much as I would love to, but it'll come up later again. What's important here is, and you see some of the literature that we built on, but there's a lot more, of course. A register is not a genre. A register is definitely not a subcorpus. And that is really important, because I've seen so many people treat a register as a subcorpus. Then they put like narration or narrative or letter or academic or something. And that's a subcorpus, and that's apparently a register. Not in our view. If a register, as we've said before, is influenced by situational and functional settings. A text does not necessarily contain only one register. That's also important. Registers are, in that sense, and many people have said this, multidimensional. Register always influences all levels of language. And the situational and functional parameters that influence it are multifactorial. And we can sometimes only focus on one. That is something that we choose to do. We choose to focus on a specific setting, and we can, of course, do that, ignoring many other influencing factors. And we also know that speakers distinguish, and that's, of course, Doug's work, and many other people have worked on this. Speakers distinguish between potentially infinitely many registers. So it's not just 3 or 5 or something. And learners have to acquire those situational and functional parameters for register difference in the L2. That's important, and that's difficult to do, and because they might be slightly different from the parameters in the L1. That's the part of the register thing that I cannot talk about today. But regarding word formation, learners have to acquire usage and distribution of lexicalized simplex and complex forms. So they don't have to just learn the forms and their meanings and their translation, but they have to acquire knowledge about the appropriate usage in a given register, as well as the morphological patterns and possibilities for productive word formation in a given register. And that's a different type of knowledge. And we are now looking at our data, that's argumentative essays, and it has been said many times that essays, of course, argumentative essays, as they've in the equal corpus, as in many corpora, they're part of a formal and informational register, like the spectrum. They have morphologically and syntactically complex nominal phrases, and it has been said before and shown in other studies that exactly that is difficult for learners to acquire. Modification and morphologically complex nouns. So for these essays, they have to do something that has been shown to be difficult. Nominal style is determined, as we all know, and I'm just repeating stuff that is probably familiar to most of you, by transition of sentential content into nominal phrases, and it is characterized by de-adjectival and de-verbal nominalizations. That is, you have to know something about word formation patterns, nominalization patterns, and compounds, of course. And it has been said for other languages, these speakers, or these papers are on Hebrew and English, the speakers of those informational formal, in many scare quotes, formal texts have to use nominal word formation. They have to use Latinate words. It's been said that neoclassical words, we would probably say. We have to compress a lot of information into a lot of function into little form, yeah? And there's a lot of underspecification. Compounding is like, compounding in German is underspecification at its best. Yeah, you leave out everything that connects those two words that I compounded. And contrary to what people say, that many people have said German is so very specific and can be used scientifically because we have such wonderful compounding. Well, compounding is underspecification. You leave out everything. Yeah? It's not very specific. It's the opposite of specific. Yeah? So what can we learn from the production data about the register knowledge of learners? Another question I cannot answer. We have looked at productivity, that is morphological productivity, from many angles. And there have been many papers and conferences and workshops on productivity. Many people have thought about it and have suggested different models of productivity. Some with the goal of computing some kind of measure. I find that extremely uninteresting to say that productivity of word formation pattern X has the number point something, yeah? But I've done these studies myself, so I can probably put them down also. But what's important for us is that every complex word, even if it's a highly lexicalized complex word, and I've learned the complex word, and I know the word, that has lexical properties, and that is a meaning, a form. If I know something about the setting, when I can use that word, then that's a lexical property. But every complex word also can be the base for productivity, even if it's highly lexicalized. And it has been shown many times before that still it could be used as a base for priming, for example, morphological priming. And I'll show you in a second. So we are back to some questions. There will be more. So what we really would like to know is, how is register knowledge acquired? Is that something that we just acquire from being exposed to lots and lots of input? Or is it explicitly taught? Some of it probably explicitly taught, some of it probably implicitly learned from input. But which is which? Do we know? How is lexical and morphological knowledge acquired? How is morphological knowledge within register knowledge acquired? Yeah? What can we learn from production data about these topics? Those are the questions at the moment. And what we can do today is just look at a tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of this in the hope that at some point we will know more. How do learners of German as a foreign language and German L1 speakers make use of complex words and argumentative essays? Now, something about the Falco corpus that many of you know, but let me just repeat this. It's a German learner corpus. It's freely available. It has many, many annotation layers. It is well documented. You can know everything about it. It's an essay corpus on 4 different topics. The contributors were able to choose between the topics, so everybody could just decide which ones they wanted. We have many different L1s, and we have a comparative corpus of German L1 authored texts that has been collected under exactly the same circumstances. So it's not like a different corpus that we're comparing to. We're comparing to L1 data that has been collected in the same setting, no dictionaries, nothing, same time, same topics. We have lots and lots of metadata about every contributor, etc., etc. It has different target hypotheses. etc. That's the paper that Marcus referred to a while ago, among many others. Today, we will only focus on nominal word formation in this data. And we added an annotation layer of nominal word formation. That's an annotation layer we didn't have. Because we deeply believe that we need to go beyond the surface. I think annotation, as you all know, is only there. The only purpose of annotation is to find similar things, to give similar things a name. Yeah? But what's similar, of course, depends on the research question, what you want to know. And I think we need to go to the sub-lexical level always if you want to answer my research questions or our research questions. I'll just show you on one slide, tiny script. You don't need to read this, but the guidelines, of course, are available and open, and you can look at them. This is only relevant and interesting to people who know German, but just be assured these are different word formation types for German. It's compounding, derivation, conversion, shortening, blah, blah, blah. Also, what is important in the essays we have is the origin of a word, because many people use neoclassical words. As I said before, that's a feature of academic registers. So we put the origin here. But some people also use English words, for example. So it's there. And we put the origin and also said whether that in the original language was a complex or simplex word. Okay, let's explore. Topic. We have 4 different topics in the corpus, and as you can see, you don't need to be able to read anything. Yeah? But just look at the 4 different topics and the different types of word formation in these topics. And remember, we controlled as much as we could. These corpora, or these parts of the same corpus, are as comparable as you can make it. I know that corpus data is never laboratory data. Corpus data is always messy and confounded with many things. But in many, many, many studies, these parts of the corpus would have been lumped together because it's one corpus. And it's more controlled than most other corpora, or many other corpora. And still, look at the topics. And that's not only the lexicon, that's word formation types. They are vastly different. That may be unsurprising, but it should still give us some food for thought. Just look at intra-individual variation in the L2 data. These are just 4 learners. Again, you don't need to be able to read anything. Look at the pie charts, and I know that pie charts are problematic in many ways. Still, here they have a very good visualization, and you will be able to see at a glance whatever these learners do is very different from what the other learners do. Huh? Just look at the purple thing, whatever, the purple wedge. It is big in learner number 297 and very small in learner number 177. Huh? Intra-individual differences between the learners, but it gets worse. Look at the L1 speakers. Again, you don't need to be able to read anything. Just look at the pie charts and the colors. And the L1 speakers do completely different things. Again, remember, it's tightly controlled. These are people who know each other sometimes. They've been in the same classroom, in the same situation, writing about the same topic. And it's not individual words, it's word formation types. So why should we expect that compounding would be so different between the people, or derivation would be so different between the people? And what does that mean to us? Yeah. Again, look at for example, the blue wedge between that one up there and that one. Yeah. Whatever the blue wedge is, yeah, we don't need to care at this moment. and this has been published. Yeah? Yeah, so we find very different distributions of word formation types for each topic, and that may be unsurprising. And I know that Magali and Stefan and others have written about it, and many people have written about this. Topics may yield different lexicons. But within a topic, and look at these are in the same topic, these are in the same topic, yeah? We find a high degree of inter-individual variation within the same topic, in a tightly controlled corpus. We also find that in the L1 data, and that challenges, of course, the underlying idea of a homogeneous lexical input. Specifically, we need to think about the value and validity of group comparisons. And I've seen many group comparisons here. And I know, again, that we're not the first people who noticed this, but I think it's a drastic difference here that you have when you look into this data and the lexicon, and whatever that may mean for the acquisition of lexical knowledge. If you look at the word formation patterns, again, we have the Falco L1, the red and the blue or green, whatever that color is, turquoise, L2, and the different topics. And you see the differences between the topics. You see here, the learners and the L1 speakers are not so different from each other. The topics are more different than the learners versus L1 in most cases. There are some interesting differences that could be looked into, but in general, it's fairly similar. The word origin patterns also are fairly similar, with sometimes the L1 speakers using a bit more foreign words, sometimes a bit less foreign words. For the neoclassical words, we find more for the learners, etc. The distributions of just compounds and derivations in just the feminism text, just one of the topics. Again, same topic, controlled setting. Yeah? You find the L1 speakers, and then speakers with English as their L1, and speakers with Danish as their L1. I chose those groups because those are the largest groups that we have with the homogeneous L1. And you see some differences, and you see that the English and the Danish, and in general, we see that they use fewer derivations and fewer compounds than the L1 speakers. We can look into this some more, like look at some of the nominal affixes in the derivation in the Falco documents. Again, only topic feminism. You again have the Danish, English, and the German L1 speakers. You see some differences in specific suffixes, for example, in ung. Yeah? So the L1 speakers use lots more ung, which is a very frequent, highly productive German suffix making nouns out of verbs. Yeah? But in the other words, in many of the other cases, you cannot even see a huge difference, and the types are very, very few. So we cannot do any calculations. I mean, we could do some calculations, but they would not be meaningful. Yeah? And then if you look at the types, again, you see that the L1 speakers of German use more different types, but not as much, and many of the types are used only once by any group. Okay. If we then come back to the different concepts of productivity underlying the models, yeah, it has been said that a linguistic element can be more productive if it can be used to coin new words more easily, more acceptably, or if it occurs with many types and or many hapaxes. Hapax is a word occurring only once. The underlying idea being that if a pattern produces many rare words, from your experience, you know that you can use it also to produce new words. Yeah? If it combines with basis in a semantically rather transparent way, that's a completely different way of looking at it. And that may be the prerequisite for the other two up there. If it occurs with many slot fillers, and we're now talking about constructions, etc., etc. But in our data, we cannot use any of these ideas because our words are too rare. We have almost only hapaxes. But many of these are lexicalized hapaxes. And also, what we find, and what's really interesting, is that we find words that are existing. For example, the word Besatzung, which means occupation, like the occupation of a country by a foreign army, Besatzung. What is meant here is Besetzung. It's a different word, slightly different. One vowel is different. It means something completely different. It says a 50-50 distribution. Besetzung would be distribution here by men and women. So you find a word that is in the lexicon. Everybody knows it. It's in the lexicon, but it means something different. So somebody really does not use the correct word. Practically all words are rare, so we cannot do any calculations. We cannot go do whatever has been done in productivity research, but we can do something different. We can look at the context. In a corpus, we have the context, and I love this, that we have it. And here, we will look at one aspect of the context that we've called path dependence. So this is the prompt that people were given. Feminism harmed women more than it benefited them, discuss. I agree it's a very silly prompt, but it's a prompt that we chose at some point. So path dependence could then mean many things. But the first thing is, if you had to do this, you could go many, many different paths. And the first decision you take will lead to the other decisions. The first decision you take in whatever you do here will influence what comes afterwards. So if you decide you will speak about household chores, then you will have a lexicon on, I don't know, washing, ironing, cleaning, blah, blah, blah. You will have a completely different lexicon. And the one decision you took in discussing this topic will influence everything. You could also decide on discussing voting rights or legal issues, like women have voting rights since whenever and blah, blah, blah. Or you could discuss domestic violence or education or bra burning. That's important to you. And many, many people, specifically men, but also some women, talk about, yes, feminism has harmed women more than it's benefited them because now the men are less polite to the women and will not open the doors anymore. Yes, sometimes you really read these essays and get very annoyed, and you just have to put them. But okay, we're not criticizing the content of the essays. But the point I'm making is, you give them a prompt, you give them an instruction, and they fill the instruction, but they have to take one first decision. And it's not possible not to decide. But whatever first decision will lead to the other decisions. And so you have many different topics within that one prompt. And there's another aspect of path dependence, and that is self-priming. And that's really important. So we have ung words, that suffix that we've talked about before. It's a frequent suffix, very productive, nominalization suffix, so it should probably be used in many of these essays because we have a nominal style. But what we see is here you see all the essays, and then you see the different, so each little square is one essay, and you see how ung is used in these. And you see that many of them don't use ung at all, but many of them, if they use it once, they will use it again very soon. So there is some kind of self-priming, and that's what I've talked about before. So the lexicon is not just I grab a word, appropriate or not, from some list that I know, but I grab a word, and even if it's a highly lexicalized word, the suffix can self-prime this suffix. And that has been shown. Yeah? And now we come back to the Deklarierung, the example that I've shown you before. In Anbetracht der heutigen sexuellen Probleme untereinander sowie der negativen Deklarierung der femininen Belegschaft als schwaches Geschlecht, blah, 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 so that you have Deklarierung. Deklarierung is a possible word. Yeah? It's used in the context of labeling or marketing. Yeah? So you have a Deklarierung of ingredients in some food that you buy. Yeah? But here, that context should have used Deklaration. Or, more appropriately, even something completely lexically completely different, that is Zuschreibung, Darstellung, blah, blah, blah. It's whatever you do, it's not the appropriate word. But how did it come about? Why did this L1 speaker, competent L1 speaker, use Deklarierung here? Well, the same author uses other words right before. Yeah? So Entwicklung, Stellung, Bewegung, Beschäftigung, Sicherung, and all of these are highly lexicalized. These are not transparent. These are not newly formed. They are highly lexicalized. You will have learned them in your vocabulary training. But this is also a native speaker, so they will know them. Yeah? They will grab them from their mental lexicon. And still, it could be the case that all of these then self-prime Deklarierung instead of Deklaration. I mean, that's just a hypothesis. We cannot prove that this is what happened, but this could be something that happened. So, could then self-priming foster the productivity of a derivation? Is that something we need to look at? That is, again, we cannot just look at words as strings. We need to look into the words, and we need to understand that these words in our mental lexicon do something. And they can prime or self-prime in this case, because you're not talking to someone else, the next word. So that's also something that we need to consider. Also something, some form of path dependence. Once you've decided on one word, it's more likely that you will use another word. Once you have two words, it's more likely that you will use the third word. Yeah? So I have two ways of path dependence through this text. So the text is not just a text. The text has a history in itself. Yeah? We've also, and that's something also that has been published, shown that we find a similar self-priming effect for complex verbs. So that's not something only for ung. That's something that's there. Also, just on a side note, this learner, this native speaker, this L1, competent L1 speaker, if you look at it and you are a German speaker, you can see that it is a bit clumsy. And somebody said yesterday that academic writing is always difficult, and this L1 speaker is still learning to do this. It's not wrong, but it's also not quite what should be achieved. Okay, I'm almost done. So what I've shown is that L1 and L2 speakers of German use a range of derivational affixes in argumentative essay writing. Both groups can use productive patterns, but neither group does it very often. Maybe because you don't have to, because all the core vocabulary is already there. And there is no need to form new words when you talk about familiar things. The groups behave in slightly different ways, but does that enable us to, or does that really lead to where it would make sense to do a group comparison? Because the large inter-individual differences in each of these groups, to me, or to us, seems to prevent some meaningful understanding of a group comparison. Of course, you can always do that. You get some numbers. You can do anything, but I would not understand what that means. It is not sufficient to learn any degree of productivity, because productivity is so dependent on so many other factors. For example, on register. So come back to the 4 topics. One of the topics is about academia. Of course, if you talk about academia, you will use many, many more neoclassical words, because all the names of the subjects that you can study are neoclassical, etc. Immediately, that will be more productive. It is not, even in that topic, or in the feminism topic, it is not a homogeneous way that you can go. It is not sufficient to learn a degree of productivity per register. And context is relevant in many, many ways. And here I've shown you 2 different types of path dependency, the subtopic of a prompt, and also the co-text that is the text that you've produced before, including the self-priming within the lexicon. New questions? So within these words, so you have many, many words, many of them are lexicalized. Do all of them, to the same degree, self-prime the next word? Or do you have to use some of them, do you have to use transparent ones, for example, that are then more able or easier to self-prime the next word, for example? Yeah? Is that different between L1 and L2? And there may be evidence that, yes, that is different. Is that, if so, is that due to the seemingly or smaller vocabulary size in the learners, or are there different activation patterns in the mental lexicon? That's something I find really interesting. And I don't know how to even go about answering that. More generally, what is the relationship between path dependence and the morphologically generative system? Also, the path dependence shows us that we cannot look at a text, and even with all this work on dispersion measures, that's extremely helpful and has shown also that we have sometimes clusters of something occurring at some point, and sometimes it's semantically motivated, sometimes it is maybe priming, etc. It shows us that we need to read through these texts and understand what's happening. Yeah? Also, at some later point, we need to look at the non-heads of the compounds, because the non-heads of the compounds can be derivations. Do they contribute to the self-priming or not? That's something we need to do later. Very involved German word formation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anke, and the floor is open for comments and questions. Yeah, Dietmar Heurers.
Thanks a lot for this very thought-provoking presentation. In particular, let me start with the last one, the sequence. Because in a sense what you're pointing out is that the way we plan writing, we need to think about the underlying cognitive processes. You mentioned lexical activation, priming, lexical priming. But doesn't that point to an even larger area that we have yet to make friends with, basically psycholinguistics? So we talk a lot about linguistic complexity, and there are people like Vera Demberg who have tried to basically then not look at our kind of definitions of linguistic complexity of all the different sorts that we here talk about, but they basically say, can you reduce it to Ted Gibson's dependency locality theory and surprisal? as a kind of sentence processing type of things. And interestingly enough, it didn't work. So what we can capture characterizing language characteristics is predictive in ways of language proficiency that the psycholinguistic notions of cognitive linguistic complexity cannot yet capture. So I think there could be a productive two-way discussion. But on the other hand, the question then is, do we need to have both, or do we need to have more of a discussion of how can we connect what we characterize descriptively, linguistically, to the actual cognitive processes of writing and of reading, because then we have more evidence, right? The beauty is then we can measure eye tracking, we can measure reaction times, and so on. So are you, in a sense, pointing out that with this kind of pointing to, we need to take into account the sequence of writing, that we should take this type of evidence more seriously, or would you like to have it more focused on, let's consider sequences of properties, but let's stay within the types of evidence that we typically look at when we look at corpora?
No, I would definitely say, and many people have said this, that we need to combine evidence from many different areas of, I mean, of course, it all depends on the research questions. If your research question is, I don't know, modeling of something in order to calculate proficiency or something, then you may not have to do this. But if your research question is in acquisition theory, like how do people acquire something or how do people process something, then definitely, yes, you need to combine this with psycholinguistic evidence and other evidence, all the evidence that you can get. I also believe that you need to really use very good linguistic theory in order to make sense of your data. It's not surface. I really strongly think that it is not the surface. It's not the form on the surface. It's not even part of speech. You have to go deeper into the linguistic characteristics if your research question is this, the ones that I had at the beginning. And that's why it was so important to me to show you the research questions that we are working on before then showing you what we can do at the moment and showing you like how this falls short of what we really want to find out. How is register knowledge acquired? How is morphological knowledge acquired? We're not there yet. But this shows, at least, it's the way to go is not to look at a surface only, but to have a very good linguistic model on word formation. And we've relied on psycholinguistic evidence here, saying the priming is psycholinguistic, has been shown in psycholinguistics for decades. Definitely.
Very basic question, so it's not as elaborate as the one before. I just wondered how you got the L1 speakers to write timed essays on those topics. Because in a British context, I mean, it's almost impossible to persuade anybody to do something outside unless they were being rewarded in some way. And if they were rewarded, then I wondered whether that would skew the results in some way. I don't know.
We persuaded teachers. We persuaded the teachers.
They were teachers.
No, these are not teachers. These are the students. So we wanted, when we collected these essays, the L1 participants, we wanted them to be of the same age than the foreign students who did the German as a foreign language. And so we persuaded the teachers in the German high schools to do this for us. It was not easy. It was friendship mainly.
Yeah, and then the students didn't rebel or say
they did not.
Okay.
And then of course, we bribed the teachers with then telling them something about their students and blah blah blah. But yes, but also in our context, it's not easy.
Yeah, right.
You would have to pay them, of course. That's a way to go.
Did you pay the teachers or did you?
No, we did not pay anyone. But you could pay people, of course.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your talk. I think that we will need to discuss it during the coffee break because it's more for discussion than for questions. But right now I have a quick question. Based on your data, do you plan to give some guidelines to teachers how to teach foreign learners how to write argumentative essays, or do you have any plans in the future to apply it in teaching process?
No, my very own interest is not didactics, but with that said, in the next period of the CRC, I'm planning a project together with a didactics professor, and she also has expressed an interest in providing some materials at some point. But at the moment, my own interest is in understanding acquisition, and I have no knowledge at all about didactics. So, not me.
Thank you.
The most striking part in the talk for me was the amount of variability that you showed. And so I was curious, for the native speakers, the amount of input they are exposed to can explain their choices. And even if you then have a path that then determines the continuation of the path, if you have enough input and thereby implicit knowledge from the incidental exposure to the lexical material, there is room for those choices. But for the foreign language learners, for me, that was striking because you also showed the variability. So what is your assumption about the acquisition device, or not acquisition device, that's too theoretically loaded, the way acquisition proceeds, that can explain this kind of variability, because it's still, a lot of it, the use of productive morphological devices will come into play when you have strategic competence needed to overcome your limitation in the lexicon that you have. So it really depends a lot for these foreign language learners. The range of things they've been exposed to will be much more limited. So how does your assumptions about acquisition explain or can lead us towards an explanation of the amount of variability you saw in the foreign language learners?
I wish I knew. I mean, I think that for morphological productivity and for register, the implicit input is extremely important, or input and then intake, or whatever you want to say. But as you said, the L2 learners, and here these are learners that, again, not speakers in the country or something, but many of them have spent some time in Germany. Not all of them, but many of them did. So they had some input, but by far not as much input as the L1 speakers. I mean, that's a huge difference here. So I don't know. And that's especially interesting, your question. I have no answer to this question. We've worked with a number of theories, but the one thing that we cannot really explain, or many things we cannot explain, but one of them is that in none of the teaching materials of German as a foreign language, morphological productivity is even mentioned. None of the materials tells these students, oh, this is derivation, and you can use ung with other, let's say, transitive verbs to make new ung nouns. Nobody tells you, or even in the verbal domain where you have particles and prefixes that can be used, and we've written about this. It's not, nowhere do they find it, and still they all do it. So somehow, somehow they have to understand by themselves, with no explicit teaching here, that they can use morphological patterns. And I would like to understand that. I don't. I really don't. And also I would like to know why the teaching materials don't mention this. Because it's useful.
Okay, one final quick question, and then we have to wrap up, I'm afraid. Yes, please.
Thank you for your talk. It was really amazing. And my question is about the input. So it's a comment on the previous question. Have you ever thought of looking at their reading and writing attitudes, because I think that it could explain a little bit of variability that you showed, the individual intervariability. So it's a quick question about that.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And when we compiled Falco, we did not do that because at that point we did not understand that that was relevant information. At the moment, within our CRC, there's another corpus that's being compiled by Beato and Milena Künast, where they do exactly that also. So now we've understood that we needed to do this, and for the next data we will have that information, but here we don't.
Okay, excellent. So far so good. Thank you very much, Anke. And yeah, we
And
have more questions.
can I say one more thing? There's my co-author, Anna Shadrova, is here, and she will give a very interesting talk this afternoon.
So thanks again for an exciting plenary.
Thank you very much, Anke, for accepting our invitation and for a wonderful talk. And thank you, Marcus. I've got a couple of announcements before you go off for the coffee break. If you haven't paid for the social dinner yet, could you do so by midday, as we need to send the final numbers off to the restaurant. As you know, we've got a walk-in tour that leaves here after the General Assembly. So if you want to go in a